You're listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.
Hi, it's Louisa Tanner Munson from Feel Good Astrology, and this is part 10 of the Saturn series, Saturn Through the Houses, where I look at the impact that Saturn would have if you, A, had Saturn in the 10th house at birth, or what would happen when Saturn does a transit through your 10th house. So looking at Saturn and the 10th house through two different lenses. So the first thing to consider is, what does Saturn represent and what does the 10th house represent? Well, Saturn, as you may well already know, if you've listened to my podcast about Saturn and some of the other Saturn through the houses, then you'll understand that Saturn is a planet that in astrology can be allocated to parenting and our fathers in particular. It also shows authority, all levels of authority really, whether it's government, schools, hospitals, legal situations, and also our employers and things like that. And also just bossy people that come into our life. So it represents all forms of authority. It also looks at our own unique struggle to find authority and our own instinctual patterns with being an authoritative figure in life. So it's a really useful planet to analyse in the birth chart. It is also a planet that shows us our limitations and where we are fearful about our performance, and also how we react when things go badly, because Saturn can give us tests of our spirit and tests of our soul and tests of our perseverance. On the real positive side, Saturn can represent our endurance, our perseverance, our determination to complete something. Saturn is regular and organised and likes to take a step-by-step approach. And when you work well with the Saturn energies, it tends to work well for you. Now, the 10th house is also, funnily enough, about authority, the authority or the status that we choose to reflect in life. So the 10th house and the MC, or the midheaven, that is the cusp between the 9th house and the 10th house, really shows how we would most like to express ourselves in the world. It shows our highest ambitions for success, how we relate to our successful selves, and to a large extent how much effort we'll take to get there. You know, how much will we put in to achieve our goals. And it also describes our goals a little bit. Also, the 10th house shows authority and our relationships to authority, and the 10th house also represents a parent. Now, you may well have heard from another recording I've done about Saturn and parenting, and also seeing your parents within your birth chart. You might have heard that astrologers are a little bit not confused, but in dispute. They have quite polar views on which house represents the mum traditionally and which house represents the father. The fourth house, in my opinion, represents predominantly the more nurturing parent, because more of the nurturing takes place in the home, which is what the fourth house represents. And I think the 10th house represents the more outward-facing, more professional, more forceful parent, the parent who has the greatest social standing in the world, which is usually the father. But those roles can be reversed. It's really important to check that with a client that you're working with, and check that out in your own chart. So having Saturn in the 10th house at the time of your birth could be like having your dad in the house of dads, which shows that quite possibly your father, or I will just say your strongest parent, so put in which parent that is, but from my perspective, as I'm talking this through, I'm going to refer to it as your father. It could be that your father is a professional man, is quite distant, and has quite a high status within the community. It's quite possible that your father was quite strict, possibly punitive. He had a very, very strong impact on your life, and we don't really know if that's for the positive or benefit of your life or for the negative, really. A lot of it depends on how well placed your Saturn is. So, for instance, is Saturn in harmonious relationships with other planets, i.e., sextiles and trines, and possibly some conjunctions? Or is Saturn in very challenging aspects to the other planets in your birth chart, i.e., squares and oppositions? Often, our Saturn has a little bit of both, and you need to sort of work out which is the strongest and which is the hardest to sort of really get a feel. There are no one size fits all kind of things with Saturn. It's often a little bit of everything. But having Saturn in the 10th house shows that your father or your most dominant parent had a very, very important influence on your self-development and the development of your self-esteem and the development of how you decided you wanted to become self-aware and become successful in your own life. Having Saturn here also shows that maybe you have a fear of putting yourself out there, a fear of being successful, a fear of having a high self-esteem, or that you want a high self-esteem but you feel limited and confused as to how to get it. So it shows where you're almost in a prison and you really want it, but you're your own worst enemy and aren't quite sure how to get there. So that is definitely one of the dynamics that can come up with Saturn in the 10th house. Something else that occurs to me is, and again, a lot of this depends on how well placed your Saturn is in relationship to other aspects. But Saturn can also show where we work hard and where we are determined and persevere and go through all the hardships and really invest in our futures and in our success. So it can also represent somebody who's quite sober in their ideas on success and their self-image. So somebody who wants to come across as a pillar within the society, somebody who wants to have the gravitas and will work very hard for it, and will work often unrewarded for it for a really, really long time. It shows somebody who has a long-term career plan and who will stick to it rigidly. There's not much flexibility. You know, this person might very well have a very set-in-stone career plan, and their career plan might involve being somebody in one of the careers that are traditionally ruled by a strong Saturn presence. So that could be law, it could be high business, like corporations, being a CEO or something. It could be the police force, because it's about moral judgments and helping people toe the line and managing people. It could also represent schools even. I know most school teachers are kind of nice and fluffy, but they have to be very disciplined and they have a lot of responsibility. So it could be that your ideas on your career are about having responsibility within the within the wider scheme of things in the community, that you need to be a pillar of community within the community. Now, I have seen the charts of a few CEOs, and Saturn is a very, very strong influence in two of those birth charts, one with the Saturn on the ascendant, one with the Saturn on the midheaven. So, you know, the ascendant and midheaven are two very, very strong indicating factors. You might also find somebody with really strong design ability, but, you know, in a very technical sort of Saturnian way, with a very strong Saturn in the 10th house. So these people are likely to work very hard towards gaining acceptance and authority within their careers, and fully expect it, and are possibly a bit overbearing at times, because they're used to having control of situations. It's just something natural, and I suspect something that they've got from their father, or the most controlling, most outward facing parent. Now, in another recording I've done called Transactional Analysis in Astrology, I actually look at the parent, adult and child spheres of ego expression according to the natal places of Saturn, the Sun and the Moon. And Saturn represents our parent ego, the way we express ourselves as a parent. Now, the most balanced parent, I think, is the one that is the nurturing parent, the one that listens to people and helps to build them up and helps to support and help people grow in the direction that they want to. And that's totally feasible. So you might be one of these fabulous, supportive, nurturing parents that helps to shape people who are more innocent or maybe more chaotic and more disorganized. That's definitely one thing. You know, Saturn doesn't necessarily mean cruelty or hardship. You know, Saturn can be very, very generous in wanting to support and nourish and promote people. The other aspect of a Saturn style parent ego is the overly critical parent. So again, if Saturn in your 10th house represents the parent, you might have the judgmental parent that will use words like ought, should, coulda, must, and will ask you, why did you do that? And what do you think the implications of that is? You know, very direct, almost judgmental questions formed to make you feel less secure. So you want to be very, very careful about which Saturn energy you are expressing yourself. Think about which you're most comfortable in. Also, having Saturn here in the 10th house represents, especially if you're not a career person and really don't care too much about it, it can represent that you have lots of authority figures within your life and that you rub up against them quite a lot. So, you know, if you're more rebellious and more free and spontaneous, you might very well come up against authority figures who are wanting to shape and control you. So really think long and hard about how Saturn is expressed within your birth chart to do with your self-expression and your career aspirations and your highest expression of yourself. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Moving on to what happens when Saturn goes over your midheaven and into the 10th house. Well, this is one of the significant transits of Saturn. I've already looked at Saturn crossing the ascendant into the 1st house. I've already looked at Saturn crossing the Icene into the 4th house. I've already looked at Saturn crossing the descendant and into the 7th house. So this is the 4th one. So Saturn here is crossing one of the angles or one of the almost like primary directions on a compass point, your north, south, east and west. And this is like your north. So when Saturn, just before Saturn crosses into the 10th house via the midheaven, Saturn's been in the 9th house, which has been about structuring your thoughts about otherness and an expanded mind and spirituality and higher knowledge. So it's quite possible that you have changed your aspirations to do with your self-esteem and how you would like to be seen within the public eye as represented by the 10th house. So wherever Saturn goes, he changes you. It challenges you and changes you. The more you change with Saturn, the easier it is. The more you resist Saturn, the more challenges you get usually. So to set the scene, Saturn crosses the midheaven, and that marks a real shift of focus from higher education and higher thinking and otherness and being challenged to think beyond what we know within our day-to-day life. And then Saturn is taking that information and our reactions to that and looking at our career and our highest expression for ourselves. So first of all, I would say it's quite a thought-provoking time because it often implies change. Secondly, I would say that Saturn has a sobering effect wherever he goes. When Saturn goes over the part of your self-expression, immediately, or pretty immediately, you start to feel less confident about yourself and slightly more reserved and more structured in the way you put yourself out there to tender. It can bring about tightness and restriction within your career and possibly unforeseen limiting circumstances to do with your career. So it could represent redundancies or pay cuts and things like that, which would obviously have a knock-on effect of knocking your feelings of self-esteem in the workplace. But it can also show, if you take this, if you understand the Saturn energy coming in and you're already dissatisfied with your job, it can also represent you taking the bull by the horns and thinking, I'm ready to apply for something and I'm going to. So it shows a shift in how you want to work and how you want to present yourself in the world. And based on what you've deduced from Saturn's previous positions in the 9th house, and before that the 8th and 7th houses, it's really informing you about the direction your life is going in, and the changes you must make. As Saturn crosses over the midheaven into the 10th house, more of the 10th house issues come up. And if you remember that Saturn represents the dad, and the 10th house also possibly represents a dad too, or a parent, it can show strain and limitations with the specific parent that it represents. If that parent's ill, then it can show that their illness is quite severe, in as much as it represents that you have a severe reaction, or it's quite burdensome, and that you have a lot to do with this parent. So it can show additional responsibilities. If you've been quite wise and quite self-aware during some of your most recent Saturn transits, then you might actually be promoted, because, where Saturn goes, you get extra responsibility and extra limitations, and almost like a restriction in time and a restriction in energy. So it can also represent that you have so many more opportunities, but there is a cost to them. So also that is worth bearing in mind. So it can be quite a trying transit, and it's probably going to be in that position, or moving through that position, for almost up to 2.5 years, possibly a little bit longer, depending on how big your 10th house is in your particular chart. But the thing to bear in mind is this too shall pass, and as it passes, it is moving you into a place of networking and higher governance and different organisations that you can link up with. So when it moves, it's going to move you into a more social and equanimous position within your birth chart. So you don't take it too much to heart. You will be back in your game soon, but the changes you're going through are absolutely essential to ensure that you stay on target to fulfill your life's mission, really. Not trying to put too much pressure on you, but it is one of the more trying transits out there. Should you want to talk this through, if you're having career issues and are a little bit concerned about Saturn's effect in the 10th house, or how you can express your Saturn 10th house more effectively, then just give me a shout. You can reach me at louisa@feelgoodastrology.com, or via social media, through Patreon, etc., or through my website. I'll be very, very happy to talk through all these implications with you directly. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, and I hope this transit goes well for you.
You've been listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson, and this recording has been made possible by all you lovely supporters at Patreon. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.